Steny Hoyer. They're Republicans like Joanne Emerson and Mike Simpson and Stephen LaTourette, people who have been around for a while, people who know how to work and get things done and get votes.
You'll actually see that this week, too, when they pass this, the 2013 spending bill. You'll probably get several dozen Republicans who don't like it because they were passing bills before this that would have spent less, and this will put it at a pace that's higher, and so a lot of Republicans won't be happy with that. But like Jason said, you'll get a lot of Democrats to vote with it.
Bonnie joins us next from Maryland. She's a Republican. Good morning, Bonnie. Bonnie, are you with us? One last try for Bonnie. Let's move on to Dot, who's in West Virginia on our Independence line. Hi, Dot.
Hi.
Good morning.
Morning. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
What did you share with us this morning?
Well, I agree with the previous caller that called about the politicians being in office only one term. I don't think they should be able to stay any longer. And I don't understand all this money that's going out for campaigning and everything. Why don't they turn around instead of spending it for their own foolishness, put it back into the economy, and we'd be living pretty good if they didn't do all that. And they go on vacation, they pass something, and then they don't pass it. Their budget, they get paid whether we get paid or not. So I don't agree with a lot of things. I don't know how I'm going to vote yet. I haven't made up my mind. So, but anyway.
Yeah, thanks for calling, Dot. Let's go to Jason Dick for a response.
It's interesting because of course most campaign funds are raised independently. They're raised from individuals and there is frequently this kind of stunning realization of how much money is in politics. But I would say also that, I mean, and this is not a cynical view, this is just sort of a realistic view, that money is being poured into local television stations, local radio stations, print advertising. It's paying for the salaries of operatives in states. It's paying for gas that goes into cars that are used to traverse states. And so there is it's not much of a, like a huge effect, but it is certainly like the money being spent in campaigns is being used in a way that benefits a lot of local economies. That's something that people don't necessarily think of when they think of, this candidate raised $10 million, but a pretty fairly decent bulk of that money is probably going to go into a local television station, which is owned, by a local businessman or businesswoman.
We have a tweet in from James who writes, both Democrats and Republicans spend too much money, but I don't see many constituents storming the doors of Congress asking for cuts. Final thoughts from you, Pete Kasparowicz, before we wrap up this morning. Will we see the Tea Party element alive and well here as we head into the election? Is that on the minds of Congress in the last couple of weeks of their work in September, and then we're sort of watching to see how much they'll really be in session here before the election takes place?
Yeah, well, again, they have a couple weeks here to do stuff, and I don't think anything's going to change in these couple weeks. They've always gotten done what they have to get done on time, and this week they'll do spending because they have to. Everything else will be delayed. And then in terms of the Tea Party votes, I'm not sure. We'll have to see. I mean, it's going to be interesting to watch. Does that core of Republicans get stronger or weaker? And that's going to determine how that goes will determine a lot of next year. Because spending continues to be the issue. That tweet you just read says it all. I mean, the debt is just every day the bigger and bigger risk, and it's weighing more on the minds of people. And it's not just Republicans. A lot of Democrats talk about that openly too. We have to manage. Bill Clinton said we have to manage the debt, or it will manage us. So this is becoming the issue of our times, and I think we're at the very early stages of learning how to deal with it.
Pete Kasparowicz from The Hill. He's the reporter and creator of the Floor Action blog. Thanks so much for being here. And Jason Dick, House editor of Roll Call. Thanks to you as well.
Senate's in a quorum call. They'll be taking up a judicial nomination at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. It's for the Southern District of Iowa, and a vote on the nomination of U.S. Attorney Stephanie Rose is scheduled for 5:30 Eastern. There's going to be a moment of silence also on the floor of the Senate before that at 4:55 p.m. Eastern. That's to honor the victims of the 1972 Munich Summer Olympics massacre. Later this week in the Senate Veterans Jobs Programs, and you can always watch the Senate live here on C-SPAN 2. While they're in a quorum call, we're going to take a look at the Transportation Security Administration 11 years after its creation.
On Mondays, we bring you our Your Money segment, where we look at how taxpayer dollars are spent on a federal program, who benefits, how the program functions, and what are the end results. Today, joining us for our Your Money segment is Mickey McCarter. He's the Homeland Security Today Washington correspondent. Thank you for coming in. We're talking about the Transportation Security Administration, how it's funded, what it does. Give us the rough overview of TSA's mission and how it's evolved since it was started.
Well, as you know, TSA guards the U.S. Airports, and there's about 425 of those airports or so where TSA screeners are stationed. And really, they're the most public face of the Department of Homeland Security for the public. You know, everybody interacts with them when they take a flight anywhere these days. And how they've expanded really a little bit since 9/11 is they've been trying to get a little bit more away from the guns, gates, and guards mentality where they're just standing watch. They're trying to be an agency that sort of is proactive instead of reactive. They're really expanding their behavior detection program, where they can try to spot suspicious behavior in airports. And you know, they're really trying to beef up the air marshals as well, which is sort of their law enforcement arm.
TSA was started 11 years ago. 9 years ago, it became part of the Department of Homeland Security. What's significant about its place under DHS and how the chain of command works?
Well, you know, I think what's significant about it right now is that it's really been reorganizing itself a little bit. You know, and again, I think the most public example of this is the screeners, the TSA screeners, were just allowed to unionize after a lot of resistance. You know, after the Department of Homeland Security once said, we don't want you to unionize because they think it might pose a risk to national security if they can't deploy quickly, or if there's some sort of, you know, squabble over where they're supposed to be at what time. So they're reorganizing a lot of those ways to try to bring training in, to bring uniformity in, and to make the agency a lot more functioning on an even keel, if you will.
Mickey McCarter, Washington correspondent for Homeland Security Today. If you'd like to talk about the Transportation Security Administration, here are the numbers to call. Democrats, 202-737-0001. Republicans, 202-737-0002. Independent callers, 202-628-0205. Mickey McCarter, how many people work for TSA, and what's the range of jobs they do? As you mentioned, we picture the screeners. Is there more to it than that?
The screeners are the vast majority of them. There's about 45,000 or so screeners. There's about 50,000 people or so at TSA in total. And again, the screeners really are the bulk of that workforce. There's 4,000 or so air marshals, a couple hundred people trained as behavior detection folks, a couple hundred other people trained as surface transportation inspectors. So there's you know, several pockets of hundreds of employees in several different spots. But that screener workforce that we see all the time really is the bulk of the agency.
How uniform is the level of screening at the various airports across the country? How similar is what you experience at an airport in Denver to an airport in Houston to an airport in Anchorage?
Well, you know, in theory, it should be exactly the same. Everybody should be getting the same scrutiny. But as we know from some of the news reports lately, there's been a lot of lapses. You know, there was a famous case in Florida recently, another famous case in Honolulu, where the screeners were found to be sort of, you know, laying down on the job, literally sometimes. And a lot of them got fired for that, and others got reprimanded, including all the way up to a federal security director, the person in charge of the airport on behalf of TSA. So, you know, in theory, they're supposed to be a lot more uniform, and they're supposed to be screening everything equally, passengers and luggage, but sometimes that doesn't happen.
Well, let's look at some of the numbers in the Transportation Security Administration. The total TSA budget for 2012, we're looking at $7.85 billion for the overall budget. And then here's how it breaks down. $105 million to install scanners at 275 airports, $275 million for baggage screening equipment. And then for these behavior detection officers, there's $236 million, also $12 million to expand the secure flight program. Let's talk about these behavior detection officers. What are they and what do they do?
Okay, well, supposedly they're scattered around the airport, and they're looking for people that just look suspicious. You know, they're sort of trained in this concept that, you know, if you're sweating or you're acting behavior, you know, erratically or something, that you may be up to no good.
And these are plain clothes.
They are, and they've come under a lot of criticism because independent critics say this has not been independently evaluated. You know, there's no scientific basis for the fact that these behavior detection officers would successfully find somebody who was trying to do harm. And in fact, its success rate in actually spotting a terrorist is really low. The TSA has pointed me to like a case or two in the past where they've been able to spot a potential terrorist. But for the most part, like, they're responsible for getting, you know, common criminals or illegal aliens or what have you, which may be an important work, but really isn't in line with their counterterrorism mission.
Mickey McCarter, as a journalist covering this, how much insight do you have? How much do they tell you about their techniques and methods? For example, do you know how they differentiate between a nervous flyer, someone who's worried about flying, from someone who's up to no good?
I do in general, because that actually has come under criticism a bit itself. I have been able to see TSA operations here in the D.C. area up close and personally. And in fact, that's sort of my specialty, to sort of look at, like, you know, how the mechanics of the agency function and how the money that they're given is spent. Getting back to the behavior detection officers there, you know, some people have said that they're not really looking for the right things, and that somebody who is committed to a terrorist act of some sort would have this more like steely gaze, that they'd be like very committed and very focused. And, you know, some independent critics have, again, said that perhaps they're looking for the wrong things.
Let's get to the phones and hear from Selby, a Republican in Pensacola, Florida. Hi, Selby.
Hey, how you doing today?
Good.
I was curious, why isn't TSA hiring our veterans that are coming back from the war, because, you know, they have experience in all this. You know, they should be the ones to have the jobs first. They've been through it. They know what's going on. And it's, you know, they're coming home with no jobs, no nothing. TSA should be hiring our veterans from Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever, because they know which way they do things.
I think the caller has a great point. You know, use that experience, put it to use, and I think TSA would be the first to say it could do better in employing veterans. The Department of Homeland Security overall does better than most federal agencies. I don't know that every year it's always hitting its target of, you know, veteran hires, but yeah, you know, that seems like, you know, the caller's suggestion seems like a no-brainer. Somebody who has that experience in dealing with explosives or erratic behavior or dangerous situations would make a great TSO, Transportation Screening Officer, as they're officially called.
Staying on this issue of employees, Jean tweets in and writes, how much of the TSA and screeners are corporate contractors? How much of Homeland Security are corporate contractors versus public workers or hires?
Well, you know, this is interesting. There's a move among the Republicans in Congress in particular to privatize TSA, to privatize airport security, and have contracting companies provide for the airports, much as they did before 9/11. And of course, Democrats generally decry that and say, well, you know, before 9/11, we allowed, you know, terrorists with box cutters to get on airplanes. And now we say, well, we live in a different environment. The contractors we got would be better. And just recently, John Mica of Florida fought and won for it to be easier for contractors to get to become the screeners at airports. And since that law passed at the beginning of this year, Orlando and San Francisco, two big airports, have gotten cleared to hire private contractors instead of using federal screeners. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. Studies have shown that one so far...
Good morning, business. Without objection. Mr. President, first of all, let me ask unanimous consent to introduce a 7-page eulogy that appeared in the Marietta Daily Journal on Sunday of this week and have it incorporated as part of the record. Without objection. The reason I want to submit the eulogy is because it is a poignant eulogy of the many accomplishments of one of my very best close personal friends, Otis Brumby, Jr. And I could read all those accomplishments if I wanted to. But you know, there are times we're called on to offer eulogies on the floor of the Senate because we have to. The times we do it because it's appropriate. The times we do it for great past leaders of our state. But on rare occasions, such as the one I have today, we do it for someone for which we have tremendous respect, love, and compassion. And so to Otis Brumby Jr.'s wife, Martha Lee, his daughters, Anna and Betsy, Lee, Spain, his son-in-law, Heath, and his son, Otis Brumby III, my love and compassion goes out to each of them during their tragedy. And I'll Wednesday morning return to Marietta, Georgia to be a part of the memorial service honoring Otis Brumby. But I just thought it'd be better to come talk about the Otis Brumby I knew rather than the one the newspapers are writing about. Because he was a dear friend, a compassionate leader, a role model and an example. He was, to me, the epitome of a journalist, a father, a friend, and a husband. Otis Brumby Jr. got his start, some ways, on the floor of the United States Senate, because in the late 1950s, his father arranged for him to page for Richard B. Russell, who, as all of us know, was really the master of the Senate for Lyndon Johnson when he was leader, later vice president, and finally president. Otis Brumby learned a lot in this chamber and on this floor, and he's told me a lot about what it was like before the cameras were here, back in the good old days when there was camaraderie and friendship amongst senators and members of the Senate. He also told me about the difficult days of the Civil Rights era, and particularly as a son of the South, what it meant to him. He came back, though, to Georgia, and after graduating from high school, went to the University of South in Sewanee, graduated as a law student graduate from the University of Georgia, headed to his passion, the law. But he didn't make it. Instead, he made it to the Marietta Daily Journal as a cub reporter for his father's newspaper, where at the age of 67, he graduated and started being a floor manager for the paper, an assistant publisher, offering expertise at a very young age. At the age of 29, he came up with a very unique concept. He said, you know, people would like to see their kids' pictures in the paper. They'd like to have stories about their sports victories. They'd like to have lots of pictures, lots of stories, but just the meat, not all the fol-de-rol that might go with it. So he started what became known as the Marietta Daily Journal and neighbor newspapers and created 27 neighborhood newspapers, all 27 of them weeklies. So successful that when Gannett decided it was going to try and do a national paper called USA Today, they sent a team of investigators for 7 days to the Marietta Daily Journal to investigate their template, their way that they published their paper, their meat and their potatoes. And quite frankly, a lot, will give you credit for USA Today, goes to the newsroom of the Marietta Daily Journal and the brilliance of that young 29-year-old reporter who later became the publisher of that newspaper. Otis Brumby died last week of prostate cancer and the effects of prostate cancer. He suffered for 2 years, and that's been a tragedy. But the tragedy for all of us is that he's gone, because he's left a mark on our county and our state and our community that just can't be easily replaced. Although he had an affinity for politics, he never served. When called on by governors for appointments, he took them, first as State Board of Education chairman, later as Board of Education chairman for the Marietta Public School System. A very wealthy man because of his success and his investments, Otis Brumby never sent his children to private schools that he could afford, because he believed the public schools needed to be the best, and he thought to send his children there as a role model, and he did. And they all were superstars in their schools, whether in academics or in athletics. And their father, Otis, supported those public school systems as a leader, a mentor, and a board member. To Marietta, Georgia, Otis Brumby was just about everything. He was its conscience. He was its benefactor, he was its leader, and from time to time he was its protagonist, where he would promote discord and a lack of harmony in order to come up with the right decision. I can tell you as a politician, when he wrote about you and you heard you were in the paper, the first thing you did was grab the newspaper. In fact, there's a column that he wrote called Around Town. It appeared every Saturday morning in the newspaper, a pretty thin part of the paper, but it was a one-page discourse on what politicians in the county were up to. And on Saturday morning, every politician in Marietta, Georgia and Cobb County, Georgia, went to their mailbox and got their Marietta Daily Journal. Because they didn't want to see what the football score was. They wanted to see what Otis Brumby had said about him from the previous week. He was the conscience of all the politicians in the community. He was the leader of the community. He was the benefactor of the community. He made it a much, much better place. Otis was not a Republican, nor was he a Democrat. He was, if anything, a populist, but he had a fiscally conservative bent to him. And unlike a lot who commentate on politics, Otis put his money where his mouth was. He wrote checks to local politicians and to people in the United States Senate. There wasn't a party bent to them, but there was always a fiscally conservative bent. In fact, I will tell you, in the 1970s, when I first ran for office in Cobb County in 1974, we didn't have any Republicans. I ran as a Republican because I was a fiscal conservative. Everybody told me I was crazy. They were right. I got beat. But Otis Brumby took an interest and wrote about the campaign and some of the things we talked about, some of the things we tried to do. He propped me up long enough to get a chance to stand on my own two legs. Sure, he would knock me down from time to time, and some of those times I quite well reserved it. But he gave us a chance. He gave everybody a chance. He was one of those journalists who would commentate on what you did, but he'd give you the strength to do what's right. Wednesday morning, I'm going to the funeral of a dear friend. I miss him already and will miss him more as the days go by. I love he and his family and all they've done for me, all they've done for my community, and all they've done for my country. So it's one of those rare times when we come to the floor to eulogize. This time for me it's personal. But this time for America, we've lost a son, we've lost a journalist, we've lost a patriot, and I've lost a best friend. May God bless Otis Brumby and his family, his grandchildren, and our community. And I yield back my time.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, I've just been listening to our colleague, the senator from Georgia, who is one of the real gentlemen of this body. And I listened to his warm words about his friend who has passed. And, you know, sometimes what people say about others is a better reflection on them than on who they're describing. And in many ways, I thought that about what Senator Isakson was just saying, because what he just said about his friend, any one of us here in the Senate could say about him, because he is a gentleman. And I very much was moved by the words of my friend. And we thank you for all you do to make this a better place. Mr. President, I've come here on different business to talk about the budget circumstance that we're in, to try to answer the question that we have heard asked in recent days, are we better off now than we were 4 years ago? I believe the answer to that question is very clear. But I think to answer the question, we have to take ourselves back 4 years and remember the conditions that we faced then. I will never forget, as long as I live, being called to an urgent meeting in the Capitol late one evening in September of 2008. I was the last one to arrive, and there were assembled the leaders, Republican and Democrat, of the House and the Senate, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Secretary of the Treasury of the Bush administration. And the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve quickly told us that they were going to take over the giant insurer, AIG, the next morning. They weren't there to ask our approval or seek our support. They were there to tell us what they were doing. And they told us that if they did not do it, they believed we would have a financial collapse within days. Mr. President, this was September of 2008. Barack Obama was not the President of the United States. George W. Bush was the President of the United States. And we were on the brink of financial collapse, according to the description of his own Secretary of the Treasury. Mr. President, let's remember what the economy was doing in the fourth quarter of 2008. The economy was shrinking at a rate of over 8%. In fact, it was shrinking at a rate of almost 9%. In the first month of 2009, the last month of the Bush administration, we lost 800,000 jobs in 1 month. So when people say, are we better off today than we were then? Well, just as a factual matter, there really can be no dispute. We are dramatically better off today than we were 4 years ago. 4 years ago, we were on the brink of financial collapse. 4 years ago, the economy was shrinking at a rate of almost 9%, and we were losing 100,000 jobs a month. Now, those are facts. They cannot be disputed. Today, we are growing, not as fast as we'd like. Jobs are being created, not as fast as we would like. But that is a dramatic improvement over 4 years ago. And let's remember, the housing market was in crisis. Home building and sales were plummeting. There were record foreclosures. The financial market crisis threatened global economic collapse. That was 4 years ago. Anybody that wonders can go back and read the headlines themselves. Because, Mr. President, those were grim days. I also remember, like it was yesterday, being part of the group that was given a responsibility to negotiate the TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. And I remember being in this complex late on a Saturday night, again with the Secretary of the Treasury of the Bush administration, and his telling us if we did not come up with a solution by 5 o'clock Sunday night, the Asian markets would open and they would collapse, and our markets would open the next day and they would collapse. So when people ask the question, are we better off today than we were 4 years ago? As a factual matter, there really is no question. None. We are dramatically better off. Mr. President, the other thing we should keep in mind is what happens after a severe financial crisis like the one we faced 4 years ago. Dr. Carmen Reinhart from the Peter Peterson Institute for International Economics and her husband, Dr. Vincent Reinhart of the American Enterprise Institute, which, by the way, is a pretty conservative place, have done an analysis, and here's what they found. After a severe financial crisis like the one we suffered 4 years ago, economic recoveries are shallower and take much longer. Here is the quote from their analysis. Real per capita GDP growth rates are significantly lower during the decade following severe financial crises. In the 10-year window following severe financial crises, unemployment rates are significantly higher than in the decade that preceded the crisis. And Mr. President, that's what we had in 2008. And again, Barack Obama was not the President of the United States. George W. Bush was President of the United States, and we had a severe financial crisis. We were on the brink of financial collapse. It takes a long time to dig out from a disaster of that magnitude. Mr. President, two of the most distinguished economists in the country, one of whom, by the way, advised John McCain in his most recent presidential race, the other, who was deputy chairman of the Federal Reserve, did an analysis of what would have happened without the federal response, what would have happened in terms of jobs. And here's what they found. With the federal response, we got 8 million jobs that we would not have had otherwise. In other words, if there had been no federal response, the red line is what would have happened to jobs. The green line is what happened as a result of federal action. 8 million fewer jobs lost than if there had been no federal response. Again, this is work that was done by Alan Blinder, former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Mark Zandi, who was one of the economic advisors to John McCain in the last presidential race. Mr. President, so when we go back to this question, are we better off now than we were 4 years ago, I think the answer is unequivocally yes. We are dramatically better off than we were 4 years ago. Now, if you're one of the people who's still unemployed, you don't feel better off. I understand that. That's dreadful. That is painful. And it's painful in every way. Not only does it hurt in the pocketbook, but much more than that, it hurts the way you feel about yourself. It hurts the way you feel about your role in your family. And so we've got lots of work to do. But if we're going to be honest with people about comparing where we are today and where we were 4 years ago, there really can be no serious question about the answer to that question. Here, the economy in the fourth quarter of 2008, that's the last quarter of the Bush administration, was shrinking at a rate of almost 9%. Now the economy is growing at a rate of 1.7% for the most recent quarter. Now, is that good? No. Would we like it to be stronger? Absolutely. But is this better than almost any other developed country in the world? Yes. All of Europe is in recession. Their economies are shrinking. All of Europe. Japan is not doing as well as we are doing. So when we look around the world and compare ourselves, you know, the United States, by comparison, is doing remarkably well given the depth of the financial crisis that we experienced. Mr. President, not only is it true in economic growth, it is true in terms of private sector jobs. Again, the last month of the Bush administration, this economy lost over 800,000 jobs in 1 month. The most recent month in the United States, we gained 103,000 jobs. That is a turnaround of over 900,000 jobs in a month. That is a dramatic improvement. Mr. President, and if we look at the stock market, we can answer that question as well. Are we better off now than we were 4 years ago? Well, this shows the stock market in March of 2009 hit its low of 65.47, the low during this period. Look where it is today, more than double what it was 4 years ago. So again, if we're seriously asking the question, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? In terms of economic growth, yes. In terms of job creation, yes. In terms of the stock market, yes. In terms of economic performance, yes. Mr. President, I've also heard my colleagues on the other side say at the convention just concluded that there's been no budget here for 3 years. Well, there's been no budget resolution, but there is a budget law that was passed called the Budget Control Act. And a law is much stronger than any resolution. A resolution is purely a congressional document, never goes to the President for his signature. A law obviously has to go to the President for his signature. So when they say there's been no budget passed, there's been no budget resolution passed, but instead Congress passed the Budget Control Act, and look what it said in the Budget Control Act. Look at what it said. The allocations, aggregates, and spending levels set in subsection B1 shall apply in the Senate in the same manner as for a concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2012. That same language is repeated in the next paragraph. The allocations, aggregates, and levels set in subsection B2 shall apply in the Senate in the same manner as for a concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2013. I just say to you, a budget is a limitation on spending. The Budget Control Act contained very clear limitations on spending for 2012 and 2013. So when our friends say there's been no budget passed by this body, oh yes there has. There's been a budget passed for 2012, one for 2013. Instead of a resolution, it was done in a law. Now, what we don't have is a long-term plan, a 10-year plan. That's what we really need. But you know, it's pretty clear both sides are not ready yet, and perhaps won't be until we've had this election, to sit down and agree to the kind of 10-year plan that we so desperately need. Mr. President, the Budget Control Act represented the largest deficit reduction package in the history of the United States. Well, how can that be? Well, because it contained $900 billion in discretionary savings over 10 years, and it included the so-called sequester that we hear so much about that added another $1.2 trillion of spending cuts over the next 10 years, for a total of $2.1 trillion in spending cuts. That is the largest deficit reduction package that we've ever passed. So again, when people say there's no budget, there's been no action taken, it's not accurate. It's not accurate. The Budget Control Act operates in the same way as a budget resolution, and it is a law. Not a resolution that's purely a congressional document that never goes to the President. The Budget Control Act passed both houses of Congress, went to the President for his signature, and cut $2.1 trillion in spending. Now, people may not like it. A lot of things I don't like about it. Certainly the sequester, I think we ought to find alternative savings for. But the fact is, this is now law, and it cut $2.1 trillion. That still leaves us with the problem of we're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that we spend, and that can't be permitted to continue. So we've got to add a package on top of the Budget Control Act. We've got to do more. We've got to add, I would prefer strongly to do another at least $3 trillion. I'd like to have, I tried to convince this Bowles-Simpson Commission to do a package of $5 trillion of deficit reduction. Actually, I tried to persuade him to do a package of $5.6 trillion of deficit reduction because we could balance the budget if we do a package that large. And, you know, the people who are on that commission will tell you, I tried repeatedly to convince my colleagues to go big. Let's do a package that really balanced the budget. And we could do it. It's not that hard, you know. I think people sometimes get it in their head that this is some impossible task. I told them, let's talk about a 6% solution. If we would do 6% more revenue than current law provides and 6% less spending, we'd save $6 trillion over 10 years and balance the budget. Now, I actually would argue for more weighting on the spending cut side of the ledger than on the revenue side. But I do this for illustrative purposes to indicate we can't do 6%. Come on. We can't do 6%? Sure we can. The occupant of the chair, governor of West Virginia, in his previous life in politics, I'll tell you, he didn't have any trouble making tough decisions. And I'll bet you, you reduce spending a lot more than 6%. And you know, you survived. You're here. You're respected. You know, we can do this. Hey, we've done much tougher things than this in the past. Mr. President, I just hope that colleagues think about this carefully. This chart is so important because it looks at the spending and the revenue lines of the federal government going back to 1950. This is 60 years of our economic history on one little chart. The red line's the spending line, the green line's the revenue line. And look what it shows. We got to, in 2010, an all-time high in spending for the last 60 years. Taking out the effect of inflation, so you got an even-steven comparison over that 60-year period. And we were at a 60-year high in spending, not surprising given the dimensions of the financial crisis that we faced. But at the same time, we were at a 60-year low in revenue. If you got record spending and record low revenue, you got record deficits and record additions to the debt, and that's exactly what was happening to us. Now, we've seen some improvement in the last few years. Spending is down as a share of GDP. Revenue is up a little bit. We still have a big chasm. Mr. President, in the midst of all this comes Representative Ryan and his plan. I would say to those who might be attracted to his plan, be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for. Because, first of all, the Ryan plan does not balance the budget if ever, until 2040. And it only balances in 2040 because of certain assumptions he told the Congressional Budget Office to make about his plan and the revenue contained in it. I personally don't think it ever balances. I don't believe it ever balances. And it is absolutely an unbalanced plan. All of the deficit reduction is on the spending side. He actually digs the revenue hole much deeper, extends all the Bush-era tax cuts, and then adds hundreds of billions of dollars of more of tax cuts, primarily to the most fortunate among us. $1 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest. He gives those with average income of over $1 million an average tax cut of $265,000 a year. Somebody's sitting out there saying, how's that possible? A person earning $1 million a year probably doesn't pay much more than $265,000. How can they, on average, be getting a $265,000 tax cut? Remember, this is the average for everybody over $1 million. So this includes people making $1 billion a year. And there are a fortunate few who make $1 billion a year. So if you take everybody over $1 million and you average the tax cut they get under the Ryan plan, it's over $265,000 a year. He has $2.9 trillion in health care cuts. So first of all, he extends all the Bush-era tax cuts. Then he adds hundreds of billions more of tax cuts for those who are the most fortunate. And to start to make up for it, he has $2.9 trillion in health care cuts. Not million, not billion, trillion. He repeals health care reform, he shifts Medicare to vouchers, and he block grants Medicaid and cuts Medicaid drastically. And Mr. President, who benefits from Medicaid? Well, low-income people, disabled people, but also a lot of middle-income people in this country benefit from Medicaid because their folks are in nursing homes and they've spent down their assets, and the only way they can stay in the nursing home is that Medicaid picks up the tab. There are hundreds of thousands of families in America, middle-class families, who have benefited from Medicaid because that's what's paid the nursing home bills for their relatives, their mom, their dad, their grandpa, their grandma. That's the truth. The Ryan budget also dramatically cuts the safety net for seniors, children, the disabled, increases uninsured by more than 30 million people. You're going to increase the number of uninsured by 30 million. Well, if you're not uninsured, why should you care? I'll tell you why you should care. Because if they aren't paid for by insurance, they're going to be paid for by all the rest of us. Because the hard reality of how the health care system works in America is this. If you're in a car accident, you don't have insurance, and you're taken to the hospital, you're treated. And if you don't have insurance to pay for it, and you don't have resources to pay for it, guess who pays for it? All the rest of us pay for it. That's why it's absolutely in our interest to have as many people insured as is possible. It's not just a nice thing to do, it's a smart thing to do. Because you know, one of the things we've found out, about a third of the people who don't have insurance can afford it. They can afford it. They just choose not to have it because they know if something drastic happens to them, all the rest of us are going to pay. Mr. President, there's also large cuts in the Ryan budget for education, for energy, for infrastructure, building roads, bridges, highways, and the rest. Those things undermine the engines of economic growth. So I don't think that's the way to go. So if we look at the Ryan budget plan on revenue, here's what we find. Provides $1 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest among us. Gives millionaires an average tax cut of more than $265,000. Does not contribute one dime of revenue to deficit reduction, and the revenues reach 18.7% of GDP by 2022. Now, why does that matter? Because the last 5 times we've balanced, the revenue of the country has been 19.6%, 19.7%, 19.8%, 20.6%. So, hey, if we're going to be serious about belling this cat, we're going to have to cut spending, we're going to have to reform the entitlements. We're also going to have to raise some revenue, hopefully not in a way that hurts economic growth, because we think we've found ways of doing it. But the Ryan tax plan, I've got to say, I don't think adds up. Why don't I believe it adds up? Well, let's look at what he proposes. First of all, he says we should reduce individual tax rates to just two, one at 10% and one at 25%. Right now, the top rate is 35%. If you reduce that rate to 25% and you have only one other rate of 10%, that package costs $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years. So instead of filling in the hole, you dig in the hole deeper. Then he puts the top corporate rate at 25%. Again, that is a significant reduction from the top corporate rate today. That costs another $1 trillion. Then he repeals the alternative minimum tax. That costs another $670 billion. Then he repeals all the tax levies in the health care reform, another $350 billion. Then he allows the stimulus provisions to expire from the Recovery Act. That's another $210 billion. So before he starts filling in the hole, he's dug the hole deeper by almost $4.5 trillion. And he says he's going to offset all of that with individual base broadening and corporate base broadening. Mr. President, the problem with that is if you do the math, you could do this, because we're spending about $1.2 trillion a year in tax expenditures. So over 10 years, it's about $15 trillion with inflation. So you could come up with this $4.5 trillion, but what would you have to do in order to do it? Almost every objective observer has said you'd have to raise taxes on the middle class, because he says this is going to be somehow in the Romney plan revenue neutral. I don't know, Ryan plan ever claimed to be revenue neutral, but if you're going to pay for this, how are you going to do it? What of the exemptions and the exclusions? Are you going to reduce the mortgage interest exemption? Are you going to reduce the health care tax exclusion? Because those do affect middle-class people. Let's be honest. Let's be straight. So there's no way that Congressman Ryan's plan does all the things he claims for it and not raising taxes on the middle class. And when he gets to a revenue level of 18.7% and says that's a historic average, that's true. The problem with that is we've never balanced the budget going back to 1969 with that amount of revenue. The 5 times we've balanced since 1969, that's 43 years ago, the revenue's been at 19.7, 19.9, 19.8, 20.6, 19.5. So just getting back to the historic average, I don't think is going to be enough. If we're looking at what it has taken to actually balance the budget in our history, we can see you got to be very close to 20%. And by the way, these levels of revenue were before the baby boom generation. And the baby boom generation, that's not a forecast. That's not a prediction. Those people have been born. They're alive today. And they are going to be eligible for Social Security and Medicare. And so, you know, if we're going to be honest with ourselves and honest with the American people, I don't think what Congressman Ryan's talking about really adds up. If we look at his budget on health care, we see $2.9 trillion in health care cuts. As I indicated, he repealed health care reform. And, you know, I hear a lot, I hear it in my state, let's repeal health care reform. Why not? Why not? Because the Congressional Budget Office tells us if you repeal it, you add over $1 trillion to the debt. you add over $1 trillion to the debt. And you deny coverage to 30 million people that would otherwise have it. Now, Mr. President, his plan also ends the effort to promote quality over quantity of care, reopens the prescription drug donut hole that raises costs to seniors by $4,200, allows insurance companies to drop coverage when you get sick. It ends the provision allowing young adults to stay on their parents' plan until the age of 26. It shifts Medicare to vouchers in 2023 and includes after that an aggressive cap on payments that most analysts have said would dramatically increase what Medicare beneficiaries would have to pay for their own health care. Currently, Medicare pays 75% of the cost, the beneficiary pays 25%. If the Ryan plan were adopted, the original Ryan plan, he subsequently put out other plans, but his original plan would have stood that on its head. He would have Medicare beneficiaries paying the substantial majority of the cost. Instead of Medicare beneficiaries paying 25%, he'd have them paying 68% of the cost, Medicare beneficiaries. Now, I've got a brother that's gravely ill in a hospital, Medicare eligible. I can tell you he's getting phenomenal care, very costly. I tell you, it would break our family. If we had to pay 68% of the cost instead of 25%, it would break our family. And we're a middle-class family. I'm talking about the extended family. So, you know, these things have real consequences. Anybody that thinks these are just, you know, political statements and they don't affect people's lives, oh yes they do. They have a profound effect on people's lives. And the Ryan plan block grants Medicaid, shifts the cost to seniors, children, disabled, and states. Mr. President, I really don't think that's the path America has in mind. Look, I like Paul Ryan. I agree with him that we're on an unsustainable course. I was on the Bowles-Simpson Commission with him, but unlike him, I was one of the 11 that supported the recommendation of Bowles-Simpson. And of the 11 of us who did, 5 were Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent. That's about as bipartisan as you can get. There were 18 commissioners. We had to get 14 to get the recommendations to a vote here in the Congress. We got 11. That's 60% of the membership voted yes. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent. Paul Ryan was part of Bowles-Simpson. He voted no because it wasn't just the way he wanted it. You know what? It wasn't just the way I wanted it either. I hated things on almost every page of that report. But as I told my staff, the only thing worse than being for it would be being against it, because it would have got us back on track. It would have lowered our deficit and debt by $4 trillion and done it with revenue and spending cuts and reform of entitlements. You know, maybe not as much on any one of those areas as I would do, but you know what? It would have made a profound difference in the economic future of this country. Perhaps the most striking thing to me in all the speeches at the Republican convention was the claim by Congressman Ryan, the attack on President Obama for supporting $716 billion in Medicare savings. Why was I so taken aback by that? Well, because I've read Congressman Ryan's own budget. His budget has precisely that same level of Medicare savings that he now politically attacks President Barack Obama for supporting. Boy, you see what former President Clinton said? He said that takes real brass to attack somebody for something you have done. Congressman Ryan, you know, I mean, when you give a speech, a major speech, before tens of millions of people listening, and you attack the president for supporting $716 billion in Medicare savings, and you've got the exact same savings in your budget, shame on you. Shame on you. Mr. President, the Catholic bishops reviewed the Ryan budget, and here's what they said. They said it fails the moral test. This is the Catholic bishops of America. And look, they got issues with the president, too. I understand that. I understand that. But this is what they said about the Ryan budget. They said it fails the moral test. The nation's Catholic bishops reiterated their demand that the federal budget protect the poor and said the GOP measure fails to meet these moral criteria. Mr. President, I think they got that right. Here's what a former Reagan economic advisor said about the Ryan budget. This is Bruce Bartlett, former Reagan administration economic advisor. This is what he said about the Ryan budget. And again, this is a former President Reagan economic advisor. Here's what he said about the Ryan budget. Distributionally, the Ryan plan is a monstrosity. The rich would receive huge tax cuts while the social safety net would be shredded to pay for them. Even as an opening bid to begin budget negotiations with the Democrats, the Ryan plan cannot be taken seriously. It is less of a wish list than a fairy tale, utterly disconnected from the real world, backed up by make-believe numbers and unreasonable assumptions. Ryan's plan isn't even an act of courage. It's just pandering to the Tea Party. A real act of courage would have been for him to admit, as all serious budget analysts know, that revenues will have to rise well above 19% of GDP to stabilize the debt. Mr. President, Mr. Bartlett, I don't know the man, but he's telling the truth. He's telling the truth. As painful as it is, he's telling the truth. Mr. President, when we go to the question, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Well, let's remember where we were 4 years ago. We were on the brink of financial collapse. Republican policies led the United States to the brink of financial collapse. They can't rewrite history. We know what happened. We tried their experiment. It didn't work. Now things have improved, not as much as we would like, and there's much more work to be done. But I trust in the judgment of the American people. I don't think they've forgotten. I certainly haven't forgotten. I will never forget where their policies took us in the fall of 2008. We were on the brink of financial collapse. Let's not repeat that failed experiment. I thank the chair and yield the floor. Notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.